Now we will address the question of how to ensure sufficient investment in flexible generation capacity and/or storage to maintain security of supply during the energy transition. Fundamentally, the question of how to ensure sufficient investment in a competitive electricity market is not new. We will review the two most commonly used policy instruments for this purpose: a strategic reserve and a capacity market. They are two examples of what we call capacity remuneration mechanisms, or simply capacity mechanisms. In this clip, we'll look at how they work and how they incentivize investment in dispatchable generation capacity. The idea is to avoid an electricity shortage which would occur when all power generators are running and demand is still not met. At such moments, the power price can become extremely high. However, because a lot of consumers are not paying attention to the real-time price, they may not respond to these high prices and may continue to consume. This could overload the system, and in the worst case, the system operator might have to shut down some consumers in order to maintain the technical stability of the system. A strategic reserve addresses this problem by placing part of the available generation capacity under the control of the system operator. Typically, this is done by purchasing or contracting old power plants that are about to be dismantled. The system operator keeps them available for emergencies. The trick of designing a strategic reserve is to limit the interference of the strategic reserve with the electricity market. We don't want the reserve to harm the revenues of the commercial generators, because then they would start to invest less. This would make the problem only worse. The idea is that the strategic reserve comes in addition to existing generation capacity and thereby increases the security of supply. However, by dispatching the reserve, the system operator does influence the market price. The trick of a strategic reserve is that its energy must be sold at a high enough price so the existing generators can recover their fixed costs and investment in generation continues to be attractive. By choosing the price at which the reserve is dispatched, the system operator can control the cost recovery of existing generators. After all, the reserve is only used when all other generators are running, so the consumers are forced to pay whatever its price is. So in theory, this is a nice instrument to manage the investment incentive. The higher the reserve price, the more the commercial generators earn, the more likely they are to invest. However, there are some difficult questions regarding the operation of a strategic reserve. When should it be dispatched? When there's a 1 or 2% reserve margin? Or when the market price for electricity is really high, but how high? And at which price should the operator sell it then? Another issue is what to do if there are not enough old generation units available to create a reserve. Should the system operator purchase new units for the reserve? How do you make sure that over time, as the market builds and dismantles power plants, the merit order of dispatch is not being disturbed, with new generation units sitting in the reserve and older ones running more frequently? Another issue is that our research shows that the effectiveness of a strategic reserve may decline when the share of solar and wind energy increases, because then the investment risk in dispatchable generation increases. So there's a risk of entering a slippery slope in which the strategic reserve has to grow in volume as the share of renewables also grows. The reason that a strategic reserve is popular is that it's easy to implement from a legal and practical point of view. All it takes is to authorize the system operator to contract additional generation units. The disadvantages are that it doesn't reduce the risk of price manipulation during shortage hours. There's a risk that the dispatch becomes inefficient, and there's an issue with the TSO controlling the market price, which runs contrary to the principle of unbundling of networks and markets. Finally, it is less effective in the presence of a high share of renewable energy. An alternative is to implement a capacity market, like several markets in the USA have. In Europe, the UK and France also have capacity markets. A capacity market is a separate market for generation capacity. It exists next to the wholesale market for electricity. The principle of a capacity market is that all consumers must buy capacity credits from generation companies. In practice, supply companies buy the credits on behalf of small and medium consumers. All dispatchable generation units can sell capacity credits, so a new market is created for dispatchable generation capacity. This ensures that there is enough generation capacity to meet demand at all times. It also provides generators with additional revenue. Because generators now recover part of their costs through this capacity market, there's no need for high price spikes anymore. So how does a capacity market work? Like in other organized markets, the capacity price is, in theory, set by the marginal bid. Because for existing plants the cost of providing capacity is very low, if they're already in the market anyway, they tend to bid at zero or at least very low prices. As a result, the price in the capacity market is set by new generation capacity. Investors bid the capacity price that they need to make a business case for a new plant. The demand in a capacity market is set by the regulator. He sets it equal to peak demand plus a reserve margin. Typically, a downward sloping demand curve is created that causes the price to decline when the supply of capacity is higher. This limits price volatility in the capacity market. The demand function is capped at the cost of new generation capacity plus a margin. This is done to make sure that the capacity price cannot go too high. Like in other markets, the price of capacity credits is set by the intersection of the supply and demand functions. Because generation companies have bid the missing money that they would need to recover the cost of new investments, in principle, the capacity market should ensure cost recovery for generators as well as the security of supply for consumers. However, there's still a risk that the capacity price becomes too low if too much generation is built. The advantage of a capacity market is that it's robust, because the reserve margin is set explicitly, so the security of supply should be guaranteed. Competition in the capacity market should ensure that the cost of capacity is reasonable, and it should stabilize energy prices. However, in practice it turns out to be a complex instrument, which means there's a risk of a regulatory failure. In addition, it may reduce demand response because it suppresses price spikes. And trade between countries with capacity markets becomes complicated. To wrap up, the two main instruments that are currently under consideration in the European Union for securing the supply of power during the energy transition are a strategic reserve and a capacity market. The capacity market is more effective, but also more complicated and still not perfect. It may discourage some demand flexibility and it complicates cross-border trade. Further improvements in the market design are needed for an all-renewable energy system.